I was looking at this chart. We're going to pull up the first page, and this is on POTUS.com if you want to see it for yourself. And I was looking at birth order, and I noticed that some of my least favorite presidents are firstborn. Obviously, there are some good presidents in there, and it's, people have different ideas of good presidents and bad presidents. But if I had to pick some of my least favorites, I would say Jimmy Carter, who's on that list. He's a firstborn. I'd also say LBJ. I'd certainly say Joe Biden, who is on that list. And although I, like Jimmy Carter, respect President George Bush for his, character, I think Jimmy Carter and George Bush were very lovely men interpersonally, or in the case of George Bush, he's alive, is a very lovely man interpersonally. Also, perhaps not the best president. So just kind of a tidbit there. LBJ, Carter, George W. Bush, and Joe Biden are all firstborns. Not crazy about LBJ's Great Society. I don't think that's panned out very well. I certainly don't think that he was stellar during the Vietnam War, as we know, was cause for his resignation. Jimmy Carter, allowing the Iranian Revolution to happen has certainly been a poor development on the world stage. President Carter was very supportive of the Shah of Iran. And then in 1978, when tensions started rising between the Shiite fundamentalists and the secularists in Iran, Jimmy Carter kind of backed off of his support of the Shah of Iran and said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, like, well, whatever happens, happens, and maybe the Shah isn't the best. And then the Shiite fundamentalists took over Iran, and that has been an absolute tragedy and disaster, not just for the Iranian people, but for the world, as Iran is one of the leading exporters of evil, as we know from their support of Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th. Also, President Carter was one of the first to call Israel an apartheid state, which also wasn't so great. And, there was kind of a bad recession during the time that Jimmy Carter was president as a result of some of his policies.
So just to be clear, this is what you consider fun?
Yes! Isn't this fun? Let's put on a party hat. Start swinging at a piñata. Do you not find this to be scintillating? Isn't that fascinating that some of my least favorite presidents are firstborn?
I'm fully scintillated.
Well, let's go on.
But please continue.
Wait, no, but this is cool.
Achieve full scintillation.
I'm about to rivet him. Yeah. Let's go on to the second chart, which is secondborn. Some of my favorite presidents are secondborn. Huh. Weird, right? Ronald Reagan is a secondborn. Abraham Lincoln is a secondborn. And those are my two favorite presidents, so that's a pattern there. A lot of people really like Theodore Roosevelt. A lot of people like FDR. A lot of people like Harry Truman. A lot of people like JFK. I guess not a lot like Richard Nixon, but he has some hardcore fans. So I actually think a lot of Americans, even though, regardless of political party, Democrat or Republican, would see their favorite president as a secondborn. Okay?
Look, Bushashuru.
Oh, gosh. Yes, that's him, George H.W. Bush. Bushushuru was a secondborn, but the first one was not. Okay, let's go on to height, another thing on this database. Interestingly, a lot of you, how many times can I say the word interesting? We should play a drinking game. I'm not going to say that word anymore. I'm going to find a synonym, or as I once said on Dennis and Julie, a cinnamon of that word. Fascinatingly, a lot of presidents were actually taller than the average height of Americans. So obviously the average height of Americans has gone up over time. Back in like the 1700s, we didn't have the best diet, so a lot of people were shorter, but every few decades or so, the inches have increased. But the vast majority, like 90% of presidents, were not only above the average height, but were several inches above the average height for their time. The tallest president was Abraham Lincoln at 6'4". The average height in the United States during the time that he was president for a man was 5'7". So he was almost a foot taller. LBJ, the second tallest president at 6'3". Donald Trump, another very tall president, also at 6'3". And then we have Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, who were easily a foot above the average height for their time. By the way, I want the camera to pan on Sean right now because I saw a flicker of light in his eyes. You were just nodding and smiling. Just saying. I'm just saying.
I'm trying to figure out why this matters. Because they stood above the crowd?
Well, I don't know. It's I'm not going to say interesting. It's, something to contemplate, indeed, why this is. I think it's because from the perception of the American voter, when you see someone who's kind of dominant in stature, you think that they're going to be dominant as far as being president. In fact, there were these psychologists at a university in the Netherlands who did a study released in 2013 looking at American elections since 1789. And they found that for 2/3 of all presidential elections, the taller candidate got more votes than the shorter candidate. That supports my theory. And that was a campaign strategy of President Trump. In 2016, we all remember that debate when Hillary Clinton was speaking. Donald Trump would walk behind her and stand very close to her, behind her, within the frame of the camera. And a lot of people were like, what an a-hole. Why would he do that? That's so domineering. That's so, many were saying it's patriarchal. I think it wasn't perhaps the nicest thing to do. He should have given her space, but that was a strategy. His campaign managers told him to kind of go up and get in the frame so that people could see that he was much taller, and they thought that it would have an effect subconsciously on the voter. Visuals are very, very important.
So height matters.
Height matters. It really does. Well, look at the 1960 presidential debate. It was the first televised presidential debate between Nixon and John F. Kennedy. People listening to that on the radio thought that Richard Nixon blew Kennedy out of the water. But people watching thought the opposite. They thought that Kennedy did a much better job. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with height, but it does have to do with visuals because Kennedy was a lot more handsome and seemingly calmer on camera than Richard Nixon. Let's look at left-handedness, okay? Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama were left-handed, in addition to Bill Clinton, Bush-Shuru, George H.W. Bush, Truman, Ford, Hoover, Garfield. And so the thing that I noticed in this case is that a lot of those presidents who are left-handed were seen as kind of shaker-uppers, for lack of a better term, within their own party. Ronald Reagan was like the darling of the 20th century Republican Party. Barack Obama was the darling of the 21st century Democratic Party. When you think of shaker-upper candidates, you think of those two. And so I think that it is worth note that they are both left-handed. Maybe it's something like they're different than other people as far as how they write, and for their whole life they've been outside of the norm, and so when they entered politics, they were the ones who were outside of the norm. I don't know. But it seems Ronald Reagan, as a left-hander, preferred a left-hander as his VP, because George H.W. Bush, Bush-Shuru, was his VP. They were both left-handed. And George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton ran against each other, and Clinton won. So we had a matchup of two left-handers vying for the presidency. On to length of inauguration speech. Quick note on this. Some of these inauguration speeches were so damn long. Oh my gosh. I think a 25-minute speech is long. Look at this. William Henry Harrison had 8,400 words in his inauguration speech. Taft had 5,400 words. And so what you notice here is that the presidents with the longest inauguration addresses were kind of old presidents. They were pre-19th, certainly pre-20th century, Yeah, they were in some cases pre-19th, in almost all cases pre-20th century candidates. And that makes sense because our attention spans were longer. We were more willing to listen to long inauguration speeches because we didn't have phones and computers and airplanes and all the damn technology, which has made our attention span shorter. We have just a few more. Let's look at death month. Apparently, the summer is a very deadly time for U.S. presidents. 7 presidents died in July and 6 died in June. Now, there are 41 deceased presidents. There are 5 former presidents who are still living. That means 13 out of the 41 deceased presidents died in June and July. That's 31% of all deceased presidents died in the summer. Now, let's look at some other months. Apparently, fall is a really good time to be a former president because very, very few presidents die in the fall. Only 2 in October and 2 in September. 1 in August. I'm going to count August as the fall. Pardons is the final thing we're looking at. This is one little fun fact I wanted to throw in because we often hear that Republican presidents, and especially big bad orange man Donald Trump, is a dictator who will come into office and pardon himself and all bad fellow authoritarian dictators so that he can bring to fruition his dictatorial heaven in the United States. Well, if we look at the history of presidential pardons, the top ones are Democrats. Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, and Barack Obama had a combined total of 10,000 pardons. Now let's look at the end of the list. President Trump, big bad orange guy, is in the bottom half, in the bottom third, in fact, of presidential pardons. He only gave 238 during his presidency. Another Republican, George W. Bush, gave only 200. George H.W. Bush gave only 77.